Philip Massinger. 1. Massinger has been more fortunately and more fairly judged than several of his greater contemporaries. 3 critics have done their best by him. The notes of Coleridge exemplify Coleridge's fragmentary and fine perceptions. The essay of Leslie Stephen is a piece of formidable, destructive analysis. And the essay of Swinburne is Swinburne's criticism at its best. None of these, probably, has put Massinger finally and irrefutably into a place. English criticism is inclined to argue or persuade rather than to state. And instead of forcing the subject to expose himself, these critics have left in their work an undissolved residuum of their own good taste, which, however impeccable, is something that requires our faith. The principles which animate this taste remain unexplained. Mr. Cruickshank's book is a work of scholarship, and the advantage of good scholarship is that it presents us with evidence which is an invitation to the critical faculty of the reader. It bestows a method rather than a judgment. It is difficult, it is perhaps the supreme difficulty of criticism, to make the facts generalize themselves. But Mr. Cruickshank at least presents us with facts which are capable of generalization. This is a service of value, and it is therefore wholly a compliment to the author to say that his appendices are as valuable as the essay itself. The sort of labour to which Mr. Cruickshank has devoted himself is one that professed critics ought more willingly to undertake. It is an important part of criticism, more important than any mere expression of opinion. To understand Elizabethan drama, it is necessary to study a dozen playwrights at once, to dissect with all care the complex growth, to ponder collaboration to the utmost line. Reading Shakespeare and several of his contemporaries is pleasure enough, perhaps all the pleasure possible for most. But if we wish to consummate and refine this pleasure by understanding it, to distill the last drop of it, to press and press the essence of each author, to apply exact measurement to our own sensations, then we must compare, and we cannot compare without parcelling the threads of authorship and influence. We must employ Mr. Cruickshank's judgments, and perhaps the most important judgment to which he has committed himself is this. Massinger, in his grasp of stagecraft, his flexible metre, his desire in the sphere of ethics to exploit both vice and virtue, is typical of an age which had much culture, but which, without being exactly corrupt, lacked moral fibre. Here, in fact, is our text. To elucidate this sentence would be to account for Massinger. We begin vaguely with good taste, by a recognition that Massinger is inferior. Can we trace this inferiority, dissolve it, and have left any element of merit? We turn first to the parallel quotations from Massinger and Shakespeare collocated by Mr. Cruickshank to make manifest Massinger's indebtedness. One of the surest of tests is the way in which a poet borrows. Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. The good poet welds his theft into a whole of feeling which is unique, utterly different from that from which it was torn. The bad poet throws it into something which has no cohesion. A good poet will usually borrow from authors remote in time, or alien in language, or diverse in interest. Chapman borrowed from Seneca, Shakespeare and Webster from Montaigne. The 2 great followers of Shakespeare, Webster and Tourneur, in their mature work, do not borrow from him. He is too close to them to be of use to them in this way. Massinger, as Mr. Cruickshank shows, borrows from Shakespeare a good deal. Let us profit by some of the quotations with which he has provided us. Massinger. Can I call back yesterday, with all their aids, that bow unto my sceptre, or restore my mind to that tranquillity and peace it then enjoyed? Shakespeare. Not poppy, nor mandragora, nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep which thou odest yesterday. Massinger's is a general rhetorical question, the language just and pure but colourless. Shakespeare's has particular significance, and the adjective drowsy and the verb medicine infuse a precise vigour. This is, on Massinger's part, an echo rather than an imitation or plagiarism, the basest, because least conscious, form of borrowing. Drowsy syrup is a condensation of meaning frequent in Shakespeare, but rare in Massinger. Massinger. Thou didst not borrow of vice her indirect, crooked, and abject means. Shakespeare. God knows, my son, by what bypaths and indirect crooked ways I met this crown. Here again, Massinger gives the general forensic statement. Shakespeare, the particular image. Indirect crooked is forceful in Shakespeare, a mere pleonasm in Massinger. Crooked ways is a metaphor. Massinger's phrase only the ghost of a metaphor. Massinger. And now, in the evening, when thou shouldst pass with honour to thy rest, wilt thou fall like a meteor? Shakespeare. I shall fall like a bright exaltation in the evening, and no man see me more. Here the lines of Massinger have their own beauty. Still, a bright exaltation appears to the eye and makes us catch our breath in the evening. Meteor is a dim simile. The word is worn. Massinger. What you deliver to me shall be locked up in a strong cabinet, of which you yourself shall keep the key. Shakespeare. 'Tis in my memory locked, and you yourself shall keep the key of it. In the preceding passage, Massinger had squeezed his simile to death. Here he drags it round the city at his heels. And how swift Shakespeare's figure is! We may add 2 more passages, not given by our commentator. Here the model is Webster. They occur on the same page, an artless confession. Here he comes, his nose held up. He hath something in the wind. Is hardly comparable to the cardinal lifts up his nose like a foul porpoise before a storm. And when we come upon, as tanned galley slaves pay such as do redeem them from the oar, it is unnecessary to turn up the great lines in the Duchess of Malfi. Massinger fancied this galley slave, for he comes with his oar again in The Bondman. Never did galley slave shake off his chains, or looked on the redemption from the oar. Now, these are mature plays, and the Roman Actor, from which we have drawn the 2 previous extracts, is said to have been the preferred play of its author. We may conclude directly from these quotations that Massinger's feeling for language had outstripped his feeling for things, that his eye and his vocabulary were not in cooperation. One of the greatest distinctions of several of his elder contemporaries, we name Middleton, Webster, Tourneur, is a gift for combining, for fusing into a single phrase, 2 or more diverse impressions. In her strong toil of grace. Of Shakespeare is such a fusion. The metaphor identifies itself with what suggests it. The resultant is one and is unique. Does the silkworm expend her yellow labours? Why does yon fellow falsify highways, and lays his life between the judge's lips to refine such a one? Keeps horse and men to beat their valours for her. Let the common sewer take it from distinction. Lust and forgetfulness have been amongst us. These lines of Tourneur and of Middleton exhibit that perpetual slight alteration of language, words perpetually juxtaposed in new and sudden combinations, meanings perpetually eingeschachtelt into meanings, which evidences a very high development of the senses, a development of the English language which we have perhaps never equalled. And indeed, with the end of Chapman, Middleton, Webster, Tourneur, Donne, we end a period when the intellect was immediately at the tips of the senses. Sensation became word, and word was sensation. The next period is the period of Milton, though still with a Marvell in it, and this period is initiated by Massinger. It is not that the word becomes less exact. Massinger is, in a wholly eulogistic sense, choice and correct. And the decay of the senses is not inconsistent with a greater sophistication of language. But every vital development in language is a development of feeling as well. The verse of Shakespeare and the major Shakespearean dramatists is an innovation of this kind, a true mutation of species. The verse practiced by Massinger is a different verse from that of his predecessors, but it is not a development based on or resulting from a new way of feeling. On the contrary, it seems to lead us away from feeling altogether. We mean that Massinger must be placed as much at the beginning of one period as at the end of another. A certain Boyle, quoted by Mr. Cruickshank, says that Milton's blank verse owes much to the study of Massinger's. In the indefinable touches which make up the music of a verse, says Boyle, in the artistic distribution of pauses, and in the unerring choice and grouping of just those words which strike the ear as the perfection of harmony, there are, if we leave Cyril Tourneur's atheist tragedy out of the question, only two masters in the drama, Shakespeare in his latest period, and Massinger. This Boyle must have had a singular ear to have preferred Tourneur's apprentice work to his Revenge's Tragedy, and one must think that he had never glanced at Ford. But though the appraisal be ludicrous, the praise is not undeserved. Mr. Cruickshank has given us an excellent example of Massinger's syntax. What though my father writ man before he was so, and confirmed it, by numbering that day no part of his life in which he did not service to his country? Was he to be free, therefore, from the laws and ceremonious form in your decrees, or else because he did as much as man in those three memorable overthrows, at Granson, Morat, Nancy, where his master, the warlike Charolois, with whose misfortunes I bear his name, lost treasure, men, and life, to be excused from payment of those sums which his own patrimony spent, his zeal to serve his country forced him to take up. It is impossible to deny the masterly construction of this passage. Perhaps there is not one living poet who could do the like. It is impossible to deny the originality. The language is pure and correct, free from muddiness or turbidity. Massinger does not confuse metaphors or heap them one upon another. He is lucid, though not easy. But if Massinger's age, without being exactly corrupt, lacks moral fibre, Massinger's verse, without being exactly corrupt, suffers from cerebral anemia. To say that an involved style is necessarily a bad style would be preposterous. But such a style should follow the involutions of a mode of perceiving, registering, and digesting impressions, which is also involved. It is to be feared that the feeling of Massinger is simple and overlaid with received ideas. Had Massinger had a nervous system as refined as that of Middleton, Tourneur, Webster, or Ford, his style would be a triumph. But such a nature was not at hand, and Massinger proceeds, not another Shakespeare, but Milton. Massinger is, in fact, at a further remove from Shakespeare than that other precursor of Milton, John Fletcher. Fletcher was, above all, an opportunist in his verse, in his momentary effects, never quite a pastiche, in his structure ready to sacrifice everything to the single sense. To Fletcher, because he was more intelligent, less will be forgiven. Fletcher had a cunning guess at feelings, and betrayed them. Massinger was unconscious and innocent. As an artisan of the theatre, he is not inferior to Fletcher, and his best tragedies have an honester unity than Bonduca. But the unity is superficial. In the Roman actor, the development of parts is out of all proportion to the central theme. In the unnatural combat, in spite of the deft handling of suspense and the quick shift from climax to a new suspense, the first part of the play is the hatred of Malfort for his son, and the second part is his passion for his daughter. It is theatrical skill, not an artistic conscience arranging emotions, that holds the two parts together. In The Duke of Milan, the appearance of Sforza at the court of his conqueror only delays the action, or rather breaks the emotional rhythm. And we have named three of Massinger's best. A dramatist who so skillfully welds together parts which have no reason for being together, who fabricates plays so well knit and so remote from unity, we should expect to exhibit the same synthetic cunning in character. Mr. Cruickshank, Coleridge, and Leslie Stephen are pretty well agreed that Massinger is no master of characterization. You can, in fact, put together heterogeneous parts to form a lively play. But a character, to be living, must be conceived from some emotional unity. A character is not to be composed of scattered observations of human nature, but of parts which are felt together. Hence it is that, although Massinger's failure to draw a moving character is no greater than his failure to make a whole play, and probably springs from the same defective sensitiveness, yet the failure in character is more conspicuous and more disastrous. A living character is not necessarily true to life. It is a person whom we can see and hear, whether he be true or false to human nature as we know it. What the creator of character needs is not so much knowledge of motives as keen sensibility. The dramatist need not understand people, but he must be exceptionally aware of them. This awareness was not given to Massinger. He inherits the traditions of conduct, female chastity, hymeneal sanctity, the fashion of honor, without either criticizing or informing them from his own experience. In the earlier drama, these conventions are merely a framework, or an alloy necessary for working the metal. The metal itself consisted of unique emotions resulting inevitably from the circumstances, resulting or inhering as inevitably as the properties of a chemical compound. Middleton's heroine, for instance, in The Changeling, exclaims in the well-known words, "Why, 'tis impossible thou canst be so wicked, to shelter such a cunning cruelty, to make his death the murderer of my honour." The word honour in such a situation is out of date, but the emotion of Beatrice at that moment, given the conditions, is as permanent and substantial as anything in human nature. The emotion of Othello in Act 5 is the emotion of a man who discovers that the worst part of his own soul has been exploited by someone more clever than he. It is this emotion carried by the writer to a very high degree of intensity. Even in so late and so decayed a drama as that of Ford, the framework of emotions and morals of the time is only the vehicle for statements of feeling which are unique and imperishable. Ford's and Ford's only. What may be considered corrupt or decadent in the morals of Massinger is not an alteration or diminution in morals. It is simply the disappearance of all the personal and real emotions which this morality supported and into which it introduced a kind of order. As soon as the emotions disappear, the morality which ordered it appears hideous. Puritanism itself became repulsive only when it appeared as the survival of a restraint, after the feelings which it restrained had gone. When Massinger's ladies resist temptation, they do not appear to undergo any important emotion. They merely know what is expected of them. They manifest themselves to us as lubricious prudes. Any age has its conventions, and any age might appear absurd when its conventions get into the hands of a man like Massinger. A man, we mean, of so exceptionally superior literary talent as Massinger's, and so paltry an imagination. The Elizabethan morality was an important convention, important because it was not consciously of one social class alone, because it provided a framework for emotions to which all classes could respond, and it hindered no feeling. It was not hypocritical, and it did not suppress. Its dark corners are haunted by the ghosts of Mary Fitton, and perhaps greater. It is a subject which has not been sufficiently investigated. Fletcher and Massinger rendered it ridiculous, not by not believing it, but because they were men of great talents who could not vivify it, because they could not fit into it passionate, complete, human characters. The tragedy of Massinger is interesting chiefly according to the definition given before, the highest degree of verbal excellence compatible with the most rudimentary development of the senses. Massinger succeeds better in something which is not tragedy, in the romantic comedy. A Very Woman deserves all the praise that Swinburne, with his almost unerring gift for selection, has bestowed upon it. The probable collaboration of Fletcher had the happiest result, for certainly that admirable comic personage, the tipsy Borachia, is handled with more humour than we expect of Massinger. It is a play which would be enjoyable on the stage. The form, however, of romantic comedy is itself inferior and decadent. There is an inflexibility about the poetic drama which is by no means a matter of classical or neoclassical or pseudo-classical law. The poetic drama might develop forms highly different from those of Greece or England, India or Japan. Conceded the utmost freedom, the romantic drama would yet remain inferior. The poetic drama must have an emotional unity. Let the emotion be whatever you like. It must have a dominant tone, and if this be strong enough, the most heterogeneous emotions may be made to reinforce it. The romantic comedy is a skillful concoction of inconsistent emotion, a review of emotion. A Very Woman is surpassingly well plotted. The debility of romantic drama does not depend upon extravagant setting, or preposterous events, or inconceivable coincidences. All these might be found in a serious tragedy or comedy. It consists in an internal incoherence of feelings, a concatenation of emotions which signifies nothing. From this type of play, so eloquent of emotional disorder, there was no swing back of the pendulum. Changes never come by a simple reinfusion into the form which the life has just left. The romantic drama was not a new form. Massinger dealt not with emotion so much as with the social abstractions of emotions, more generalized and therefore more quickly and easily interchangeable within the confines of a single action. He was not guided by direct communications through the nerves. Romantic drama tended, accordingly, toward what is sometimes called the typical, but which is not the truly typical. For the typical figure in a drama is always particularized, an individual. The tendency of the romantic drama was toward a form which continued it in removing its more conspicuous vices, was toward a more severe external order. This form was the heroic drama. We look into Dryden's Essay on Heroic Plays, and we find that love and valor ought to be the subject of an heroic poem. Massinger, in his destruction of the old drama, had prepared the way for Dryden. The intellect had perhaps exhausted the old conventions. It was not able to supply the impoverishment of feeling. Such are the reflections aroused by an examination of some of Massinger's plays in the light of Mr. Cruickshank's statement that Massinger's age had much more culture, but without being exactly corrupt, lacked moral fiber. The statement may be supported. In order to fit into our estimate of Massinger the two admirable comedies, A New Way to Pay Old Debts and The City Madam, a more extensive research would be required than is possible within our limits. 2. Massinger's tragedy may be summarized for the unprepared reader as being very dreary. It is dreary, unless one is prepared by a somewhat extensive knowledge of his livelier contemporaries to grasp without fatigue precisely the elements in it which are capable of giving pleasure, or unless one is incited by a curious interest in versification. In comedy, however, Massinger was one of the few masters in the language. He was a master in a comedy which is serious, even somber. And in one aspect of it, there are only two names to mention with his, those of Marlowe and Jonson. In comedy, as a matter of fact, a greater variety of methods were discovered and employed than in tragedy. The method of Kyd, as developed by Shakespeare, was the standard for English tragedy down to Otway and to Shelley. But both individual temperament and varying epochs made more play with comedy. The comedy of Lyly is one thing, that of Shakespeare, followed by Beaumont and Fletcher, is another, and that of Middleton is a third. And Massinger, while he has his own comedy, is nearer to Marlowe and Jonson than to any of these. Massinger was, in fact, as a comic writer, fortunate in the moment at which he wrote. His comedy is transitional, but it happens to be one of those transitions which contains some merit not anticipated by predecessors or refined upon by later writers. The comedy of Jonson is nearer to caricature, that of Middleton a more photographic delineation of low life. Massinger is nearer to Restoration comedy, and more like his contemporary Shirley, in assuming a certain social level, certain distinctions of class, as a postulate of his comedy. This resemblance to later comedy is also the important point of difference between Massinger and earlier comedy, but Massinger's comedy differs just as widely from the comedy of manners proper. He is closer to that in his romantic drama, in A Very Woman, than in A New Way to Pay Old Debts. In his comedy, his interest is not in the follies of love-making or the absurdities of social pretense, but in the unmasking of villainy. Just as the old comedy of Molière differs in principle from the new comedy of Marivaux, so the old comedy of Massinger differs from the new comedy of his contemporary Shirley. And as in France, so in England. The more farcical comedy was, the more serious. Massinger's great comic rogues, Sir Giles Overreach and Luke Frugal, are members of the large English family which includes Barabbas and Sir Epicure Mammon, and from which Sir Tunbelly Clumsy claims descent. What distinguishes Massinger from Marlowe and Jonson is, in the main, an inferiority. The greatest comic characters of these two dramatists a slight work in comparison with Shakespeare's best. Falstaff has a third dimension, and Epicure Mammon has only two. But this slightness is part of the nature of the art which Jonson practiced, a smaller art than Shakespeare's. The inferiority of Massinger to Jonson is an inferiority not of one type of art to another, but within Jonson's type. It is a simple deficiency. Marlowe's and Jonson's comedies were a view of life. They were, as great literature is, the transformation of a personality into a personal work of art, their lifetime's work, long or short. Massinger is not simply a smaller personality. His personality hardly exists. He did not, out of his own personality, build a world of art, as Shakespeare and Marlowe and Jonson built. In the fine pages which Rémy de Gourmont devotes to Flaubert in his Problème du style, the great critic declares, La vie est un dépouillement. Le but de l'activité propre de l'homme est de nettoyer sa personnalité, de la laver de toutes les souillures qui déposa l'éducation, de la dégager de toutes les empreintes qui laceront nos admirations adolescentes. And again, Flaubert incorporait toute sa sensibilité à ses œuvres. Hors de ses livres, où il se transvasait goutte à goutte jusqu'à la lie, Flaubert est fort peu intéressant. Of Shakespeare notably, of Jonson less, of Marlowe, and of Keats to the term of life allowed him, one can say that they se transvasaient goutte à goutte, and in England, which has produced a prodigious number of men of genius and comparatively few works of art, there are not many writers of whom one can say it. Certainly not of Massinger. A brilliant master of technique, he was not, in this profound sense, an artist. And so we come to inquire how, if this is so, he could have written two great comedies. We shall probably be obliged to conclude that a large part of their excellence is, in some way which should be defined, fortuitous, and that therefore they are, however remarkable, not works of perfect art. This objection raised by Leslie Stephen to Massinger's method of revealing a villain has great cogency, but I am inclined to believe that the cogency is due to a somewhat different reason from that which Leslie Stephen assigns. His statement is too a priorist to be quite trustworthy. There is no reason why a comedy or a tragedy villain should not declare himself, and in as long a period as the author likes. But the sort of villain who may run on in this way is a simple villain. Simple, not simpliste. Barabbas and Volpone can declare their character because they have no inside. Appearance and reality are coincident. They have forces in particular directions. Massinger's two villains are not simple. Giles' overreach is essentially a great force directed upon small objects. A great force, a small mind. The terror of a dozen parishes instead of the conqueror of a world. The force is misapplied, attenuated, thwarted by the man's vulgarity. He is a great man of the city, without fear, but with the most abject awe of the aristocracy. He is, accordingly, not simple, but a product of a certain civilization, and he is not wholly conscious. His monologues are meant to be, not what he thinks he is, but what he really is. And yet they are not the truth about him, and he himself certainly does not know the truth. To declare himself, therefore, is impossible. Nay, when my ears are pierced with widows' cries, and undone orphans wash with tears my threshold, I only think what 'tis to have my daughter right honourable, and 'tis a powerful charm, makes me insensible of remorse or pity, or the least sting of conscience. This is the wrong note. Elsewhere we have the right. Thou art a fool. In being out of office, I am out of danger. Where, if I were a justice, besides the trouble, I might, or out of wilfulness or error, run myself finally into a praemunire, and so become a prey to the informer. No, I'll have none of it. 'Tis enough I keep greedy at my devotion. So he serve my purposes. Let him hang, or damn, I care not. And how well tuned, well modulated here, the diction. The man is audible and visible. But from passages like the first, we may be permitted to infer that Massinger was unconscious of trying to develop a different kind of character from any that Marlowe or Jonson had invented. Luke Frugal, in The City Madam, is not so great a character as Sir Giles Overreach, but Luke Frugal just misses being almost the greatest of all hypocrites. His humility in the first act of the play is more than half real. The error in his portraiture is not the extravagant hocus-pocus of supposed Indian necromancers by which he is so easily duped, but the premature disclosure of villainy in his temptation of the two apprentices of his brother. But for this, he would be a perfect chameleon of circumstance. Here again we feel that Massinger was conscious only of inventing a rascal of the old simpler farce type. But the play is not a farce in the sense in which The Jew of Malta, The Alchemist, Bartholomew Fair are farces. Massinger had not the personality to create great farce, and he was too serious to invent trivial farce. The ability to perform that slight distortion of all the elements in the world of a play or a story, so that this world is complete in itself, which was given to Marlowe and Jonson and to Rabelais, and which is prerequisite to great farce, was denied to Massinger. On the other hand, his temperament was more closely related to theirs than to that of Shirley or the Restoration wits. His two comedies therefore occupy a place by themselves. His ways of thinking and feeling isolate him from both the Elizabethan and the later Caroline mind. He might also have been a great realist. He is killed by conventions which were suitable for the preceding literary generation, but not for his. Had Massinger been a greater man, a man of more intellectual courage, the current of English literature immediately after him might have taken a different course. The defect is precisely a defect of personality. He is not, however, the only man of letters who, at the moment when a new view of life is wanted, has looked at life through the eyes of his predecessors, and only at manners through his own.